How can I get my OpenClaw set up securely? In this video, if you watch till the end, I will show you exactly the best beginner-friendly practices to secure your OpenClaw, whether you're setting up on a personal machine, Mac Mini, virtual private server, so you don't expose yourself to any vulnerabilities. We're going to go over from basic OpenClaw setups to some more advanced configurations and to some general meta-level security precautions to have whenever you're working with OpenClaw, AI, or any of these other sorts of sensitive information that could potentially expose you online. Without anything else to say, let's get right into the computer. Let's dive right in. We're going to talk exactly about how to set this thing up securely. Before we start anything with OpenClaw or whatever, the most important thing here is to understand that you don't want to expose anything sensitive like API keys inside your markdown files, because this thing does self-modify its own files and its own file structure. So whenever you're providing it any sort of sensitive information like API keys, you don't want to keep that inside of files. You want to put that inside of, say, OpenClaw configuration file environments, or let the AI itself configure its own environment variables so everything is stored securely and encrypted and not publicly exposed in plain text. Another good practice is that if you have any sort of keys, you want to basically have them rotated so they are not forever indefinitely available, but instead they expire on certain dates, so no one can potentially find this key and then pretty much access it and use your own usage or, say, credits. And then even the gateway token. Let's say your gateway was exposed publicly to the internet. You have a token, someone has that token, you have no password in order to enter into your OpenClaw dashboard. Someone can access it and even see your information. So the thing here is you do not want to give away your gateway token. So once you go inside of your OpenClaw dashboard and you're in the environment variables, whether you're adding it manually or you're getting help from the AI to insert it into its own configuration files, here's where you would see all your environment variables inside of the config setting page. And here's ideally where you want to store everything, not in plain text or not any sort of markdown file inside of your OpenClaw. My OpenClaw is being run off of localhost. I am basically secure shelling into my virtual private server. So the only way I can access this is through my computer, right? There's a key, it's being accessed on the server, it's matched, and that's how we're accessing it. When you just start up OpenClaw, you'll probably see the token here, or maybe even say in the URL. So when you just first start up, it's gonna launch a browser and then you'll pretty much see everything there. That gateway token you do not want exposed. I'm just going to quickly show you an example of downloading this thing. And if you ever run into the step where it has anything to do with the gateway, how you can pretty much have this hosted on localhost. So there is no binded port to 000, which pretty much makes your thing accessible. If someone has that access to your IP and they know your IP, then pretty much anyone can access it, right? Especially on your network. So if you ever choose the manual and then here it's asking you whether you want a remote gateway or local, just do local, where to host it, and pretty much here you can just pick your provider, whatever, blah blah blah, and then eventually it'll sign you in, right? If you just complete and follow the setup. But this is just like a little note. I didn't have my API key there, so obviously I'm not going to sign in into OpenAI, but that's just one thing you want to keep in mind when it comes to like setting up on your computer. Just choose the local option, so it's pretty much running off your local host, off your machine's resources, and you won't have to be exposed to that vulnerability. So now when it comes to setting up your OpenClaw and say working up with a virtual private server, let's just start there. Whenever you're using a virtual private server, it's very real that your public IP can be exposed by default, which means it's reachable by anyone on the internet, especially if there are like reverse proxies. And this is why security really matters, especially if you're not hosting it on, say, localhost on your computer's resources, or if you don't have at least a password to your virtual private server, or the best option really is just to be able to secure shell into it. And pretty much what that means is just there's a key on your computer and you want to pair that with the server. So then anytime you log into the virtual private server and the keys match, that's the only way you can access it. So usually if you're, say, following a setup service like DigitalOcean, they show you how to pretty much enable the pairing for secure shell. I created a video on this, so you can check that out. But you pair your device with the secure shell, and then anytime you access and activate your terminal, your computer will be able to log into the OpenClaw dashboard and you'll be able to see the OpenClaw dashboard, right? So if you're ever trying to access the virtual private server, if you set up the password, it's less secure because then people can just botnet it or say just do some sort of brute force attack where they can cycle through many sources of passwords. And then once the password is unlocked, they can pretty much access your whole entire virtual private server. The service like DigitalOcean actually makes it really easy. That's usually how I follow and set up the virtual private servers. So if you're ever actually wondering which option to go, just do the secure shell. It's way more secure. Only your computer can access the server. And then you just wiped out 80% plus of the vulnerabilities when you're working with a virtual private server. Another thing I want to mention is on firewalls, something pretty important to understand when you are working with a virtual private server, because a firewall is pretty much like a doorman and allows you or like any outside visitors to enter anything happening on a specific server. So in this case, the DigitalOcean droplet that you're creating to host the OpenClaw that you're downloading into. So just to be clear, when you're getting OpenClaw and say you are also getting a virtual private server, you're renting resources on the internet in the cloud so you can download OpenClaw inside of it. And it's also important that not only your OpenClaw is secure itself, but the virtual private server so no one can access it. And that's kind of what I'm mentioning here by having a secure shell in order to secure your virtual private server. No one can access it. There is no publicly exposed URL, and then you're good. Usually when say you are secure shelling into the OpenClaw's gateway, so when you're setting up firewalls, everything's pretty much secured right off the bat because you are secure shelling usually with port 2022 into the OpenClaw's gateway, and then everything's pretty much already configured. DigitalOcean has a one-click setup where you can pretty much have everything installed properly, and then once you log in on your personal machine, you can access pretty much everything there. But sometimes you have to work around the security in a firewall. So sometimes when you are trying to work with like webhooks or other sorts of services where they may need to like access some sort of event or trigger that happens inside of your OpenClaw, there's no way anything's going to be able to access it. So you have to create a tunnel. So that's where working with firewalls comes in, because you create and open up ports, which are just basically, imagine there's like an apartment and there are all these doors and entrances in order to enter the apartment. If you have every single door closed off, there's no way anyone can access it, which is pretty much a firewall. So when you open up a specific port for a specific provider, API, or service that you're setting up to work with, that's when it becomes important to create a very specific firewall port for that. And then only through that port can you access any sorts of information. And you would do that pretty much in the networking tab on firewall, but there's also other providers that have their own firewall security settings. So that's where you would modify that. But if you're just setting up OpenClaw, you don't really have to worry about this. Pretty much explained, this is kind of what a firewall looks like, but it's pretty much just having a single entrance door, or specifically allowing what kind of visitors to allow in and who not to allow. Everyone else is pretty much blocked. So if you've properly configured the gateway and the configuration upon the setup, and you're just following the OpenClaw installation through the terminal, and then you open it in your dashboard, it's going to show you, like in the URL I showed you before, that you have been accessed and you are pretty much inside the local host 18789. So it means you're pretty much secure. It's being hosted off your machine's resources, and you don't have to worry about, say, working with any sort of remote networks or any other sort of publicly exposed information. Also, whenever you are adding any API keys when working with OpenClaw, it's still very important that you have them stored in the OpenClaw configuration, kind of what I showed you earlier where it says information is redacted. That's where you're going to have you should store any sensitive informations like tokens or API keys for your OpenClaw to access and, say, use any specific tools or calls outside of its own environment. Also, OpenClaw is always having their stuff updated continuously. So whenever you're working with this thing, make sure you're always updating it, because they always are patching various different security patches, vulnerabilities, and things of that nature. So whenever you are in OpenClaw, just make sure you always update whenever there is a existent update available. Now, when you're running this thing on a Mac Mini or a personal computer or some other personal machine, it works differently because you don't have to worry about all of this firewall bullcrap or any of this other secure shelling stuff into some other environment, because it's all running locally on your own machine and its resource. So pretty much a lot of the threats are already eliminated and you don't even have to worry about that. So it's not publicly reachable. There is no outside public IP address to worry about. There is no firewall needed to set up. No need to secure shell or use any sort of keys to pair with a server or anything like that, because you're just running it off of your machine's resources, whether it's your personal machine, it's some sort of computer sitting at home you have, or say some Mac mini that everyone's doing, right? Whatever machine you're using and this thing's installed on is going to be running off that CPU and off that GPU. And that's pretty much it. That's its own environment. The one thing I want to mention is that, everyone's talking about, say, remote accessing your bot. If you're using, especially if you're using a separate computer or personal machine to run this thing off of your main. So if you're using a Mac mini, if you're using another extra spare computer you have laying around, well, a lot of people are doing it now. Even OpenClaw has a Tailscale setup inside of the OpenClaw configuration. So when you're following this setup, there is a way where you can enable and set up Tailscale for this. So in essence, what Tailscale is, it pretty much creates a encrypted secure tunnel in order to access the machine of your OpenClaw. You don't have to do this. I know no one's speaking about, I guess you can say in depth about how this all works, but you don't have to do this technically. You can literally just use a VNC client when you're pretty much accessing remotely the Mac mini or say the computer, whatever it is, just with RustDesk. RustDesk is just a VNC client where you can pretty much just use your computer, download RustDesk on another computer or the machine that you're running OpenClaw on, and then you can access it. So you don't need Tailscale here, but you should get Tailscale if you want everything secured and encrypted, because if you're using RustDesk itself, you are relying on that third party and whatever tunnel they have or whatever in order to access that machine's resources, which isn't encrypted. So anything that happens, any conversation exchanges, any data transmitted, any telemetry, anything that gets exposed onto the tunnel, it's potentially exposed. That's the security risk. It's potentially exposed, it's vulnerable, and there is the risk where something can happen to that information. So the reason why Tailscale exists is you download Tailscale on both computers. So then you pretty much have one computer connected, you have another computer connected, and then a tunnel that is created between the two devices, it is encrypted. So whatever safeguards they use is encrypted traffic that you're pretty much tunneling in from your computer into the other computer, and that's how you can pretty much control whatever's happening on, say, your Mac mini. Other people, how they're kind of accessing their resources on another computer is doing things like Obsidian Sync, or maybe even mounting their devices onto their personal machine. So there's many ways you can work around, but if you're looking for something more so where you can remotely control it, then this is kind of my take on the whole thing behind Tailscale, and how maybe you can even consider using RustDesk. I'm not opposed to using RustDesk, but just beware if you're using something like RustDesk that's not going to be fully encrypted. From what I understand, Tailscale is more encrypted. And another thing to consider is whether you want to run Docker. Some people are also setting up Docker to securely set up their OpenClaw on a personal machine. Especially on a personal machine, you don't necessarily need to do this for a virtual private server, because in a virtual private server, everything's already self-contained, right? That's the whole reason why you're getting a virtual private server, to separate it from your own environment. So when it comes to using Docker, I know this is not the logo of Docker, but Docker is like that big whale, right? That blue whale everyone knows about. And what does it mean when you're talking about a container? A container from Docker is pretty much just a self-contained environment where whatever resources are available to OpenClaw once you install it, that's the only thing it can access, nothing else on your machine. So whenever you spin up a Docker container, it automatically does that. As long as Docker is running and open on your computer, it's automatically going to be spinning up these containers in the background. So whenever you are opening and using your OpenClaw, it doesn't have say root or admin access, like full super user access to your computer, unless you give it permissions and access to. So if it tries to do something stupid, it's not going to have access to it. So that's why people are getting Docker and then trying to run OpenClaw with it versus without it, because without it and you just install OpenClaw on your computer, it pretty much has the same exact access to your computer you do, you know what I mean? So it is kind of more dangerous, and that's why people are saying, hey, this is why you should use Docker. Here's my little take on it. You can read it. Also, one other thing, what people are doing is they're creating separate user accounts from their main super user. So that's one thing that does matter, and it can help you from giving your AI pretty much root admin access for the claw. Same thing, once again, even if you're accessing the OpenClaw dashboard, just as I showed you earlier, you don't want to be hosting the keys in any markdown files or anything like that. You want to be always only configuring the OpenClaw config file. And once again, even if you're generating a gateway token here, because you pretty much still need it, you do not want that exposed, so that does still matter. Now, here's my take on OpenClaw skills, because now we're kind of moving away from the installation process to actually now making your bot more powerful with skills. The one thing I want to mention on that is that there are, I misspelled Claw Hub here, my bad, but the one thing I want to mention on skills here is that whenever you're downloading anything that is not yours, I mean, in the beginning of OpenClaw, there were so many skills that were contaminated with malware and potential backend doors into people's different personal devices or servers. And that's a huge security risk, because imagine anyone can do something with your data, with anything around your API. It's like giving them the same exact access into it, or somehow it funnels whatever's happening inside your setup into some other system, which is not good. If you're ever using a tool like, say, skills.sh, which is basically a skill repository or just a skill hub of like all the various different kinds of skills, as you can see here, 80,000 freaking skills that you can arm your OpenClaw with, or say you're using something like Claw Hub, you have to be very careful in terms of what you are getting, right? Because there are some official tools here. There are some, say, really popular ones, but just because this is all here, just understand the moment you access a community tool, a community plugin, or a skill, it exposes you to potential vulnerability for something you don't want this agent or AI to do for you, right? Especially if someone has some sort of malicious intent. Sometimes what people do is they rename their skill names after popular ones. So when someone searches something up, the fake one might outrank the original one, and then from there you're immediately exposed to some sort of threat. My advice on this is, if you want something, or you're handling sensitive information and you don't want to be exposed to some sort of malware, then just recreate it. You can literally prompt the bot to recreate it, analyze the files, use something like Claude to pretty much understand what's going on inside this skill, to pretty much create a plan how to replicate it, and then to pretty much create the own skill itself in your own environment without having to download it onto your computer or the environment where your OpenClaw is. Otherwise, trust only highly vetted sources or official documentation from startups and companies that are promoting their own skills, because if it's on their own documentation or on their website, then you can know and rest assured that it's from them, versus just some random person online trying to create something on behalf of, say, Shopify, or on behalf of, say, some big brand name out there. I also wanted to touch on API providers one last time, because I know I mentioned some like just basic information on APIs earlier, but this is another pretty big one. When you're choosing and working with API providers, especially on an open router, because some of these API providers, they're in beta, maybe they're testing, they're trying to get user information. And by default, if they are offering very highly attractive incentives, promotions, free offerings, before you give it any sort of sensitive information, or some people, like, if you're just pasting them tokens and API keys, you're immediately exposing your stuff to their research and their training, which can get baked into their AI models. And then if someone prompt injects it or does something stupid with, or it's just something malicious with it, your API key could be potentially be exposed in a massive data sweep. And the thing is, I want to show you an example of how this looks like, at least in OpenRouter. I'm pretty sure other services also do something similar if they have any promotional offerings. But say, for instance, you want to use this model here, right? This model, it's currently free, but there's going to be a note here that anytime you use it, everything is logged into the provider's model and product and services. So you just want to be careful whenever there's any of these notes mentioning on any telemetry collection, because then you could just be potentially exposed and your information can be trained on their AIs. So to sum it up, make sure you're always storing API keys inside of your config. Make sure you're rotating them periodically. That pretty much just means you have expiration dates for your keys and they're not just for indefinite use. If you're on a virtual private server, use SSH keys, which are secure shell keys, which pretty much connect your computer to the server, and that's the only way you can access it, not passwords, so someone can brute force into it. If you're doing anything on a virtual private server, and sometimes you have to open up any ports, that's how you have to create a firewall in order to allow specific processes or events to happen. Otherwise, your APIs or tools or skills that you're trying to set up, or even any automations, they will not work unless you have a firewall port open specifically for that. If you're doing a gateway to localhost only, don't do it to, say, something on a network or a remote network or anything which can expose you publicly. Always do localhost, so it's hosted off of your computer. Use Docker for containment, especially if you are on your own computer, because then it gives it its own container. not all root admin access to your computer, so you don't let the AI do something stupid. Only download trusted skills. That's probably a big one I'd say, or just copy them. And before you get any of these API keys, just know what you're agreeing with, because some of these guys, they're collecting data. Data is a huge moat for these AI training labs. So they are trying to collect everything from traceability, reasoning, things of that nature. So whatever they're reasoning and collecting with your own data, that's super valuable to them. So best believe they will be looking at it. So if you have anything that is sensitive, do not expose it. This is my video on security. I hope you found a lot of value and insightful information in it. If you'd like to see more content around this kind of stuff or something specific, let me know down in the comments. Subscribe for more. I talk about AI. I also have a newsletter where I share AI insights every single week. So subscribe to that. It's on my website. Other than that, thanks for watching. See you in another one.